If you think water is for putting out fires, you've never seen it make 400 extra horsepower. There was a moment in World War II when a pilot, cornered at 25,000 feet, could shove the throttle past the red line and push a button that engineers warned him never to touch unless he was about to die. When he did, the engine didn't cool down. It went violent. Manifold pressure spiked, horsepower surged, and the only thing keeping that engine from detonating itself into scrap metal was water. Not race fuel, not a bigger intercooler. Water. And that same chemical cheat code is still humiliating modern cooling systems today. This isn't folklore, it's physics, weaponized. Let's talk about it. In 1944, American fighter pilots flying the P-51 Mustang were pushing the limits of what piston engines could survive. One of those pilots was Chuck Yeager. Before he ever broke the sound barrier, he was flying combat missions over Europe in a Mustang powered by a Packard-built Merlin engine. Under normal conditions, that engine made enormous power for its time. But when things got desperate, pilots engaged something called anti-detonant injection, ADI. A 50-50 mixture of water and methanol was sprayed into the intake when the throttle was pushed past its rated limit. Why? Because boost creates heat, and heat creates detonation. The Merlin engine, built under a license by the Packard Motor Car Company from the original Rolls-Royce design, relied on supercharging to make power at altitude. But there's a hard ceiling in forced induction. Compress air too much and combustion becomes unstable. Fuel ignites before the spark plug. Pressure spikes uncontrollably. Pistons collapse. Water meth injection moved that ceiling. When Yeager or any other pilot hit war emergency power, that mixture entered the intake charge, absorbed heat as it vaporized, and dramatically increased knock resistance. Horsepower jumped. Engine survival time shrank, but survival of the pilot improved. That wasn't a performance upgrade, it was a life or death button. And the principle behind it is brutally simple. Fast forward 20 years. The war is over. Veterans come home. Some of them open repair shops. Some of them build race cars. By the early 1960s, supercharged drag cars were pushing factory V8s far beyond what Detroit ever intended. Fuel quality was inconsistent. Compression ratios were climbing. Blower drive ratios were getting reckless. And detonation was still the enemy. Some builders remembered the aviation trick. Instead of trying to bolt on bigger and bigger intercoolers, which barely existed in practical automotive form at the time, they rigged crude injection systems, windshield washer pumps, simple nozzles tapped into carb hats, water-methanol mixtures siphoned into boosted intake air. It wasn't elegant, but suddenly engines stopped detonating under the same boost levels that had been cracking pistons the week before. Timing could be advanced. Boost could be raised. Cheap pump gas behaved like race fuel. Backyard builders were beating better-funded teams not because they had more hardware, but because they understood heat. That's the through line. World War II survival, 1960s drag strip ingenuity, modern turbo tuning. Same physics. Here's what's actually happening inside the engine. When a turbocharger or supercharger compresses air, it increases temperature. That's unavoidable. It's basic thermodynamics. Hot air is less dense. Less dense air carries less oxygen. Less oxygen limits combustion efficiency. Worse, elevated temperature increases the tendency for the air-fuel mixture to auto-ignite before the spark plug fires. That uncontrolled combustion event is detonation. Detonation is violent. Pressure spikes become chaotic, bearings get hammered, pistons collapse, ringlands fracture. Now introduce water. Water has an extremely high latent heat of vaporization. When it transitions from liquid to vapor, it absorbs a tremendous amount of heat energy. When finely atomized water is injected into the intake charge, it evaporates inside the combustion chamber, absorbing heat from the surrounding mixture. Cylinder temperatures drop. Knock resistance increases dramatically. Now add methanol. Methanol isn't just there to keep the water from freezing, it's a high-octane fuel in its own right. It burns cooler than gasoline and has a much higher resistance to knock.
So while the water is absorbing heat and stabilizing combustion, the methanol is contributing combustible energy and octane support. Together, they don't just cool the air before it enters the engine, they cool and chemically stabilize the combustion event itself. That's why in certain setups, water-meth injection can do something an intercooler cannot. An intercooler reduces intake air temperature before combustion. Water-meth alters what happens during combustion. It moves the knock threshold, it shifts the thermal limit. That's a different level of control. So if it's that effective, why didn't every performance car from the 1980s onward have a water-meth tank? Because early automotive systems were crude. Most setups were triggered by a simple pressure switch. Boost hits a threshold, injection turns on. If the pump failed at wide-open throttle, if the nozzle clogged, if the tank ran dry, the engine was still tuned for higher boost and more timing, but the knock suppression vanished instantly. That meant catastrophic detonation in seconds. As electronic fuel injection matured, tuners gained precise control over fuel and ignition timing. Large air-to-air intercoolers became more common. Race fuel became accessible. Water-meth developed a reputation for being risky, unpredictable, a band-aid, so it faded from mainstream builds. Now look at modern engines: smaller displacement, higher boost, tighter engine bays, direct injection, and pump gas that is not designed for aggressive timing under sustained boost. Tuners are running into thermal limits again. Intercoolers can only be so large. There's only so much airflow available. Heat soak becomes a real problem in street-driven turbo cars. And that's when the World War II cheat code quietly reappears. Modern water-meth systems are controlled by electronic modules that monitor boost pressure, airflow, or injector duty cycle. Flow ramps in smoothly. Flow sensors detect faults. Fail-safes pull timing or reduce boost to fluid flow drops. It's no longer an on-off gamble. It's integrated into the tune. When calibrated correctly, the results are measurable. Lower intake temperatures under load, reduced knock activity, more aggressive timing advance, higher boost levels on 91 or 93 octane pump gas. Gains of 50 to 100 wheel horsepower on certain turbo platforms are not uncommon, not because water adds power directly, because it allows the engine to operate closer to its real mechanical limits without crossing into detonation. That's the distinction. It doesn't replace intercooling. It amplifies what the engine can safely tolerate. So, does it embarrass modern intercoolers? In some scenarios, absolutely. An intercooler is passive. It can only reduce temperature before combustion. Water-meth is active. It intervenes in the combustion event itself. One fights heat upstream. The other attacks it at the moment of ignition. That's why the principles survived 80 years. It wasn't a gimmick for fighter pilots, it wasn't a hack for 1960s gassers, and it's not a trend for modern turbo builds. It's a thermodynamic lever, the same lever that pilots like Chuck Yeager pulled when they needed power that shouldn't have been possible. Water didn't make those engines weaker, it let them survive power levels that would have destroyed them. And today, when properly engineered, it still does. The most violent performance upgrade of the 1940s wasn't bigger displacement, it wasn't more boost, it was understanding heat and realizing that sometimes the thing used to put out fires is the very thing that lets you burn harder.